Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Well, Harry S. Truman of Missouri became president when President Franklin D. Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia in April 1945. And the Truman years were a bundle of contradictions, really. On the one hand, World War II was over, the Depression had ended, and people were enjoying the good life, settling down, raising families, buying consumer goods, having tremendous prosperity. On the other hand, the U.S., with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended the war in Japan in World War II, entered into a new and perhaps even more frightening period than World War II, the period called the Cold War, which was marked by deadly rivalry between the United States and the communist government known as the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. And what made this so frightening was that both sides had the new terrifying superweapon, the atomic bomb. Um, and eventually, both nations reached the point where any nuclear conflict could annihilate human civilization, life on this earth as we know it. And so the Truman years, the Cold War period, were also a time of tremendous anxiety and difficulty for Americans and for the world. So that's what we're going to explore in this lecture. Now, of course, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, had inaugurated the New Deal policies in an attempt to end the Great Depression, but really it must be said that the New Deal did not put an end to the Great Depression. What really stopped the Depression was World War II, because when the United States got into World War II, immediately the government began spending huge amounts of money on weapons, tanks, ammunition, aircraft carriers, all kinds of military equipment. And that is what put everybody in America back to work. Essentially, anyone who needed or wanted a job could have one. And so we can say that World War II really was what ended the Depression. And it also ended the New Deal, because once everybody went back to work, there was no longer any need for programs like the WPA or the Civilian Conservation Corps. And people were really ready for a break. They were ready for prosperity. They were looking forward to the good life. They had been through 16 years of depression and war, and they were ready to enjoy their life. And as soon as the war ended and factories began returning to manufacturing their own goods instead of war materials, big corporations began playing up to this desire for people to really live the good life seen in terms of material possessions. And so you see a barrage of advertising, especially targeted at the servicemen who were coming back from the war, like this ad on the right. This is for a popular automobile of the time called the Nash Rambler. And you see that it's targeting that serviceman and telling him he needs to find a girlfriend or a wife, get that convertible, and really start enjoying life. We call this the culture of rising expectations. People really expected and demanded prosperity, a good living, material comforts. And most people got that. Most people got that. Because even after the war, there was still a very high demand for labor, and that meant that labor unions were really in a very strong bargaining position. They could ask for and get just about anything they wanted for their workers. So especially factory workers during this period got good salaries and fantastic benefits packages. This is when corporate health insurance was invented. And not only that, but most workers were even getting pensions. This is almost a thing of the past in many professions, but at that time, companies, when you retired, would actually give you a monthly check in addition to your Social Security, a pension. So that was a great benefit. Also, many workers got what were called cost of living allowances, COLA, which meant that every year their salaries automatically increased according to the rate of inflation. So if prices went up 3% in the country, your salary went up 3% automatically. That just doesn't happen anymore. And really, this was the golden age in a sense for the American worker, especially for the American blue collar worker, the kind that worked in factories. And of course, most of these jobs no longer exist in America. Why? Well, they've gone offshore, they've gone to other countries. Also, workers have been replaced by technology, by machines and computers, and so forth. And so, really, this generation had fabulous workplace opportunities that probably Americans will never see again. And this this period, or this kind of cradle to grave protection almost for the workers, economists call this liberal capitalism. And so the labor unions during this period really lose their edge. In a sense, they make their peace with the capitalist system, with big business, because the workers are getting everything they want. So they no longer have an incentive to fight for social change or new government programs or socialism or massive change in society. So labor unions shift their focus to protecting the high wages and benefits that they had already obtained for their workers. So in a way, they become more conservative, and you could say that workers move from being have-nots to being the haves. They are privileged people now, and they are determined to protect their privileges and to enjoy this new consumerism, to enjoy that nice house in the suburbs with the nice fancy car, the dishwasher, the blender, the two-car garage, and so forth. And a big component of this was building a family. Obviously, many of the servicemen and also the women who had served overseas in various capacities wanted, when they got back, they wanted life to get back to normal. They wanted to settle down. They wanted to raise a family. And so we see the birth rate in America going up astronomically after World War II. And we call this the baby boom. The baby boom. And you've probably heard that term on the news or on the internet, because the baby boomers, most of them are still with us. We'll talk more about that in a minute. It's interesting that this comes along in a way partly with an increase in sexual permissiveness. People used to think that the sexual revolution only began in the 1960s with the hippie counterculture and so forth. A number of years ago, there was a very good historian named Alan Petney who came out with a book called The Permissive Society. And in this book, Petney proved that actually the increase in premarital sex in pregnancies out of wedlock actually began during World War II. Because you can imagine when, let's say you're a soldier and you're getting ready to go off to war, you don't know if you're going to ever come back alive. In a situation like that, traditional morality, moral teachings sometimes just go out the window. And a lot of young couples began practicing premarital sex when they wouldn't have done that before. And so you see that the pregnancy rate begins to go up during the war. And there is also a surge in those last-minute marriages before the service people go away. And it's interesting that that really continues even after the war. More people get married and more people stay married. Actually, for during the late 40s and 50s, the divorce rate actually drops after a brief spike immediately after World War II. The divorce rate drops over time. So more and more people are getting married. They're marrying younger. It's interesting during this post-war period that the average man was married at age 22. The average woman was married already at age 20. And that's just the average. You know, some people were marrying even younger than that. And what that meant was that you had more years of fertility for that couple to have more and more babies. And there was the desire to have babies. Now, in spite of that, many of these newly married women after the war did continue to work. You know, a lot of them had gone into the factories during the war. You think of the feminist icon Rosie the Riveter. And they didn't keep those kinds of jobs. But after the war, many women did keep jobs, a lot of them in secretarial type jobs, teaching jobs, etc. In 1950, 34% of women had a job, and more than half of those women were actually married. The motive for this was for these women also to be able to buy even more consumer goods than they could on just their husband's salary. But in spite of this increase in the number of working women, the number of births also just explodes during this baby boom period. So in 1946, there were 3.4 million live births in the United States. That increased to 3.8 million in 1947. And then between 1954 and 1964, more than 4 million Americans were born every year. It was the biggest population cohort in American history, still is. And that is causing issues for your generation, because when you think about it, so if you were born in 1945, okay, right now as I'm giving this lecture in 2019, you would be 74 years old. And so these baby boomers are now retired. Many of them are no longer contributing in a sense to the economy, but they are on Social Security, they are on Medicare, they are receiving government benefits. Meanwhile, your generation is actually hard pressed to pay for those benefits, because Americans are not having as many babies now as they did during the baby boom period. So we're talking about fewer taxpayers paying for this big cohort of population, this baby boom age group. And so that's why Social Security is broken and may require drastic steps to fix. You'll hear more about that over the next 10 to 20 years. It's going to be a major social crisis. But in the baby boom period, the explosion of population was a key to the expanding economy as well, because these growing families needed houses, they needed schools. So construction jobs really are widely available for anyone who wants one. Teaching jobs are more available as new schools and colleges are built. And a lot of that was fueled by a law which Congress had passed during the war, which was known popularly as the GI Bill of Rights. Okay, soldiers were called GIs, government issue. The GI Bill of Rights basically gave a free ride to returning soldiers who wanted to go to college, a free education, and it also provided subsidies for building a house. And so the GI Bill of Rights pumped a lot of money into the economy and really fueled the housing and education boom. And obviously, something like this still exists nowadays because our veterans do get their education subsidized, and that really starts with the GI Bill of Rights. With this baby boom generation, you get an expanding economy fueled by this growth in population. But as I mentioned, there were ominous signs on the horizon with the start of the Cold War. Really, the Cold War period lasts from 1945 to 1991. It starts immediately as soon as World War II ends. And the U.S. and our former allies during World War II, the Soviet Union, begin to go head to head. And the reason why it's called the Cold War is that the United States and the USSR never actually declared war on each other during this period. We never actually went to war directly with the Soviets, and there were never any battles fought between us, so it was a Cold War. However, we'll see later in this lecture, and then in the future lectures on the 1960s, that there were times when the Cold War did become quite hot. In places like Korea and Vietnam, when essentially we fought what are known as proxy wars, where we would support South Korea, for example, against Soviet-supported North Korea. And so there were times when armed conflict erupted, but we never actually went to war directly with the Soviets. So, what was the origin of the Cold War? Well, you have to understand that in World War II, the Soviet Union suffered more than any other country, by far. I mean, Hitler had invaded Russia in 1940, caused a lot of havoc, and actually 23 million Soviet citizens died in World War II, more than in any other country. And the communist dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, was determined that after the war, the Soviets would get some kind of compensation for all of that terrible suffering. And he was determined, especially, that the Soviets would take over land in Eastern Europe. And you see that policy already anticipated during World War II with the event known as the Warsaw Uprising. Now, in August 1944, those Jews that stayed alive in the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw staged a big revolt against the Nazi troops that were controlling and occupying Warsaw, Poland, the capital of Poland. Now, it just so happened that Stalin had his Red Army, the Soviet Army, parked right outside of Warsaw when this happened. And if he had wanted to, he could have driven right into the city, helped the Jewish rebels to defeat the Nazis, and he could have liberated them. But instead, Stalin kept his army outside and watched while the Nazis crushed the Warsaw Uprising and killed all of its participants. Why did Stalin do that? Well, he already had plans to take over Poland after the war, and he was happy to let Hitler do his dirty work for him and get rid of all the natural leaders of the Polish people, so that after the war, the Soviets could sweep in and take over that country without any resistance. Why didn't our leadership, especially our president FDR, stop Stalin in his territorial ambitions in Eastern Europe? Well, Roosevelt wanted the Soviets to help us defeat Japan. I mean, you have to realize that it was not a foregone conclusion that we were going to actually beat Japan. You know, they were a very tough opponent. And FDR really wanted Stalin to come in and help us defeat the Japanese the way that the Soviets were helping to defeat Hitler. And FDR kept that desire right up to the end of his life, and you see it coming into play at the famous conference at Yalta in Russia in February 1945. You see the picture there from Yalta, FDR in the middle looking very sick. Obviously, he only had a few more months to live. Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. And at Yalta, in return for the promise that the Soviets would help us eventually defeat Japan, Roosevelt and Churchill allowed Stalin to take over part of Poland. And of course, Stalin promised that Poland would be a, quote, mighty, free, and independent Poland, end quote. But in reality, what happened was a communist puppet regime was set up in Poland, and FDR and Churchill did nothing to stop that. And it's kind of ironic that the Soviets did finally come into the war against Japan 3 days after we bombed Hiroshima, when the war was essentially over. And so the Soviets got to take over Eastern Europe, and we really didn't get anything in return for that. You see here on this map, that red line that runs down the center kind of diagonally from the top left towards the bottom right, that's the boundary of the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and part of the eastern part of Germany were all taken over, all became communist, and became part of the Soviet sphere of influence. And so that line, that boundary, became known as the Iron Curtain. And that phrase was coined by Winston Churchill, who was actually voted out of office, believe it or not, in 1945. That's gratitude for you. And as a private citizen, was invited by President Harry S. Truman to give a commencement speech at Westminster College in Missouri. And this became one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. And I want you to watch a little video clip. From here on out, these lectures will have supplementary videos, mostly from YouTube. And so I'll just ask you to pause this video and go down to the folder underneath the video lectures for this module. It's called Supplementary Videos for the Truman and Eisenhower Lectures. And look for the one that says Churchill Iron Curtain Speech, and watch that and then come back. It may help that Georgia View you can actually have open in 2 different tabs at the same time. So if you open Georgia View in a second tab, you can go over there, watch this supplementary video on the Iron Curtain Speech, and then come right back. All right, we're back. Now, that speech, I think, gives you a clue as to why the Western world, especially the United States, were so determined to stop communist expansion, to stop the communists from expanding into any more countries. You heard Churchill say that it would have been easy to stop Hitler from expanding if only the Western democracies had gotten together and really done something about it. World War II would never have happened. And so there was the sense that we can't let Stalin become the next Hitler. We can't let the Soviets expand any further beyond what they've already taken over. And so that was one of the driving motives behind the Cold War, to try to prevent another war by stopping the Soviets from expanding. But that, of course, led to a great deal of tension in its own right. All right, well, a little more about President Truman, Harry S. Truman. He had been a senator from Missouri. He became the third of FDR's vice presidents in 1945, of course, succeeded to the presidency when FDR died. By the way, that isn't a typo. Harry S. Truman without the period after the S. Harry Truman's middle name was S. When he was born, his parents just wanted to call him Harry Truman, but the official who made his birth certificate thought, oh, gosh, the poor kid, he needs to at least have a middle initial. And so he wrote on the birth certificate S. So that was Harry Truman's middle name, S. Um, Truman, of course, had to make perhaps the most difficult decision ever made by any president when he decided to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he did that because he knew that it was going to be a very long and difficult struggle to conquer the Japanese homeland, house-to-house street fighting. Perhaps millions of American soldiers would die. And so he decided that it would be better to use the A-bombs to get the war over quickly and prevent that from happening. It was a very fateful decision, though, ushering in the atomic age. Truman really wasn't very popular during his administration. He actually has grown. His prestige has grown in the years after his death, and historians now really see him as a very important and effective president in a lot of ways. He was a very tough-minded individual. He was very honest, very plain-spoken. He took responsibility for decisions. He had on his desk a sign that said, "The buck stops here." And what that means, in those days, there was this phrase, passing the buck. That was when you didn't want to deal with something or take responsibility for it. You would pass the buck. You would kick the can down the road. You would let someone else handle it. Well, Truman said the buck stops here. That meant that he had the final say in everything. He would take responsibility. He would make decisions and not pass the buck. And that tough-minded attitude really came into play during the Cold War. And Truman was very determined to stop Soviet expansion. He was influenced in that partly by a document that was written by one of our diplomats in Moscow, the Soviet capital, called The Long Telegram. One night, George Kennan sat down and typed out a very long telegram to the State Department in Washington. It was all about Kennan's vision of the Soviets and their plans. Kennan believed that the Soviets would stop at nothing. They were determined to take over the world. They would not let anything get in their way of expanding communist ideology throughout the world. And so in the long telegram, Kennan suggested that U.S. foreign policy should be based on containment. That's a very important concept for this period. Containment meant doing anything necessary to stop the Soviets from taking over any more countries. That could mean using military force. It could also mean simply making friends with other countries by giving them money, by giving them stuff, technology, microwave ovens, TVs, whatever, in an attempt to keep them from going communist, to make them our friends, and to keep them as part of the so-called free world. And Truman really was impressed with the long telegram by George Kennan, and so not long after that, or about a year after that, in March 1947, in a speech he announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine. Truman said we should, quote, support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation, that means being taken over, by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And what he was really saying here was that if it looked like any country in the world was going to be taken over by the communists or go communist, that it was the U.S.'s duty to step in and prevent that from happening. And so that policy of containment became really the linchpin of American foreign policy during this Cold War period. And we see this most of all in the very, very famous law that became known as that created what we call the Marshall Plan. George C. Marshall was a very important general in World War II who became Truman's Secretary of State after the war. And it was Marshall who suggested that the way to prevent Europe, the rest of Europe, from going communist was to send massive amounts of American dollars over to rebuild Europe, which had been, of course, devastated and destroyed by the war. And really, the United States at this point in history was in a very good position to do that. I mean, our economy was unbelievable. We were by far the strongest economy in the world. We only had 7% of the world's population, but Americans enjoyed 42% of the world's income, and we produced about half of all the goods manufactured in the entire world were produced by Americans in the late 1940s, which is almost unbelievable. And that type of dominance by the U.S. in the world economy, that's another thing that will never come again, most likely. But it was a period of incredible prosperity, and so we could actually afford to send money throughout the world to stop communism. And so Congress passed the European Recovery Program, that's the official name of the Marshall Plan, in April 1948. And so billions of dollars, $13.34 billion, was sent over to Western Europe between 1948 and 1952 to rebuild Europe. And so, yes, after we had bombed Germany into rubble, we actually rebuilt Germany. It was the United States that rebuilt Germany and made it a superpower again after World War II, believe it or not. American tax dollars did that. And it was actually very effective because once the Marshall Plan was instituted, no more European countries ever went communist, besides the ones that had already gone communist. And so political scientists would call this an example of soft power. Hard power means military force. Soft power is the more gentle means of persuasion, using diplomacy, using money, using technology to persuade people to get on our side and stay on our side. And that's what the Marshall Plan was about, and it did work. I'm about to show you another disturbing image. Moving on to another topic, the creation of the State of Israel, which was obviously very closely linked to the Holocaust in Europe. And again, I think it's just like with the lynching images that we saw earlier in the course. I think it's important for us to remember this. There are actually people in the world today who deny that the Holocaust ever happened. But there were many Americans who could not deny it, like Senator Alvin Barkley, who saw the aftermath in this photograph, like the many American servicemen who helped to liberate the concentration camps after the war. They knew that this was a reality, and that awareness really fed into the United States' support for the new nation of Israel. How did it come about? Well, it was linked to a new institution called the United Nations. After World War I, of course, President Woodrow Wilson had helped to create the League of Nations, but the United States had never joined the League of Nations. We were not a part of that. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt was determined to start a new and more effective international organization after World War II. And so in 1945 in San Francisco, a conference took place which drafted the United Nations Charter, which set the bylaws for the organization called the UN, which is still, of course, with us today. How does the United Nations work? Well, any of the member nations can bring up an issue in what's called the General Assembly and can propose a motion, and then all the nations can vote on that. But the real power in the United Nations is held by the members of what's called the Security Council. Only certain nations are represented on the Security Council. there's a sort of rotation. Some nations go on and off periodically, but there are 5 nations that are permanently represented on the Security Council. And at that time, those 5 nations were the United States, the UK, the USSR, now Russia, has that seat, but in those times the Soviet Union had the 3rd permanent seat, France, and China. Those were the 5 members of the Security Council, and still are, except that the Russia now has the Soviet seat. Now, what gives the Security Council members so much power is that any one member of the Security Council can actually veto any decision by the General Assembly. And this happens a lot. We've seen in recent years that the Syrian dictator Assad, for instance, was using chemical weapons on his own people to try to suppress a rebellion, and the General Assembly passed resolutions to try and stop that. But Russia, which is Assad's ally, vetoed those resolutions, and so the UN was not able to do anything. Now, to be fair to Russia, the United States, have also vetoed many, many resolutions, and so we've used that power as well. One of the key documents ever produced by the United Nations is the UN Declaration of Human Rights that was approved in 1948, and it was drafted by a committee that was that Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt's widow, actually chaired. And so former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt really had a major role in producing this very key document, which sets out the basics of human rights, human dignity, what human beings are entitled to throughout the world. So this was a great achievement of the United Nations. But the UN did not do as well in their attempt to try to solve the problem of the Jews in Europe. And of course, the concern was, how do we prevent another Holocaust from happening? Because the Jewish people had been subject to persecution and massacres really for thousands of years. And after the Holocaust, the leaders of the free world were determined to never let that happen again. And so there was a great desire among Jews, supported by others, to have their homeland back, to have a new nation of Israel. And of course, the Jews had originally come from Palestine, from the land of Canaan, from the Middle Eastern area that we call Palestine. Israel has many names, but that region had belonged to the Jewish nation historically, and the Jews wanted to go back there and to have their own nation again. And so many Jewish settlers during and after the war had gone to Israel. But, of course, there were already people there who had been living there for many centuries, and they considered it to be their land, and those were the Palestinian Arabs. And they, of course, did not want a new nation of Israel coming and taking their homeland. And so there was a huge conflict. The United Nations tried to step in, and they created a plan for what we call a two-state solution, where there would be a Jewish state of Israel and a Palestinian Arab state alongside it. The Jewish settlers agreed to that plan. The Arabs refused. And so when that happened, the Jews and the Arabs went to war in the Middle East. The Jews won this fight very handily, and so they autonomously then created the State of Israel in 1948. And partly what enabled them to do that was the great support they got from Truman and from the United States government. And of course, Israel still is one of the United States' main allies to this day. And it's partly, again, because of that memory of the Holocaust. But, of course, this is a problem that still hasn't been solved, and it's still a crisis. It's still in the news, ongoing fighting between Israel and the Palestinians. And so, by trying to solve one problem, in a sense, the leaders of this period created another ongoing problem that we're still trying to deal with. The Cold War really heated up when Joseph Stalin decided to take a very, very significant step with regard to East Germany. Now, if you look at the map here, the situation in Germany after the war was quite unusual. There were four zones, the British, French, American, and Soviet zones after the war. And eventually what wound up happening was that the British, French, and American zones joined together and became the nation of West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, while the eastern part acquired a communist government, became known as East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. But in the city of Berlin, in East Germany, there was a part of the city, the western part of the city, that was still controlled by the United States, even though it was surrounded by communist East Germany, and that was West Berlin. And in 1948, Stalin decided to try to get rid of West Berlin by starving it out. And so Hitler had built this big superhighway into Berlin called the Autobahn. It's still there, by the way. It's famous because parts of the Autobahn have no speed limit. So if you're a speed demon, you can go there and enjoy that someday. But in any case, Stalin shut down the Autobahn so that no supplies could get into West Berlin, trying to get the West Berliners to surrender and become part of East Germany. Well, Truman really showed his grit and determination when this happened. And so Truman began to send U.S. aircraft into West Berlin. Several times a day, American planes would land in West Berlin with crucial supplies of food, medicine, and so forth, so that West Berlin could continue to exist as part of the free world. And this went on for several months until finally Stalin realized that Truman was not going to back down. And eventually he gave up and allowed West Berlin to continue in existence. So this was a victory for Truman, but as we'll see moving forward in the course, Berlin would continue to be a real flashpoint of Cold War tensions. Moving on to another topic now. Life for African Americans began to change also coming out of World War II. And that, I think, in large part had to do with the fact that many African Americans served in the war. They had fought for their country, they had bled, maybe been wounded, or seen friends get killed for the United States of America, fighting for freedom, supposedly. And then, when they got back to the United States, they were not willing to accept the same kind of treatment that they had always received under the Jim Crow regime in the South, especially. They had a different attitude, and they just weren't going to take it anymore. And so we see that in a comment by a corporal, an African American corporal from Alabama in 1945, who said, quote, "I went into the Army an N-word. I'm coming out a man." In other words, he simply was not going to take that second-class citizenship anymore. And I think many African American service people who came back were determined now to fight for better treatment based on the sacrifice they had offered their country. So I really think this is the beginning, or a beginning, of the civil rights movement of the 1950s. Of course, it had other deep roots, but was really radicalized by the determination of these service people to be treated better. Another very famous example of what I'm talking about, Jackie Robinson was born in Cairo, Georgia, but his family moved to California. He went to school at UCLA and lettered in 4 different sports. Then he entered the Army and actually got in trouble because he refused to ride on in the back of a segregated bus on a military base, and he was actually court-martialed for that. And so Second Lieutenant Jackie Robinson was discharged from the service. He actually received an honorable discharge, but he was discharged from the service for his resistance to Jim Crow. But Robinson's contribution to civil rights would happen in a different way on the sporting fields, because he chose, out of his many sports, he chose to become a professional baseball player. And he started, at this time, there were no black players in Major League Baseball. There was a separate Negro League. So great African American ball players like Satchel Paige spent their careers in the segregated Negro leagues. But Jackie Robinson came to the notice of the president of the Brooklyn Dodgers branch, Rickey. By the way, the LA Dodgers at that time were in the city of Brooklyn, in part of New York City. And so they were the Brooklyn Dodgers at that time. Rickey wanted to integrate Major League Baseball, and he wanted Jackie Robinson to do that. He saw that Robinson had the qualities that would be necessary to make that transition, especially the tremendous strength of character, because, of course, Robinson, when he broke into the major leagues in 1947, suffered tremendous harassment from crowds and from fellow ball players, calling him racial slurs. Sometimes even opposing ball players would sharpen their spikes so that when they slid into Robinson, who was playing second base, they could injure him. So he was subject to a lot of ill treatment, but he came through it with tremendous class and composure and professionalism. So much so that in 1947, Jackie Robinson became Major League Baseball's Rookie of the Year. And I don't think you can overestimate Robinson's contribution to civil rights just by playing baseball, because baseball was the #1 sport at that time. It was much bigger than football or basketball in those days. And so every day you could go to the ballpark and you could see there, as long as Robinson was on the ball field, you could see integration in action. You could essentially see a new vision of society happening right there before your eyes. African Americans and whites working together, playing together, being together. And so that example really, I think, was very crucial for the civil rights movement. And later, of course, Robinson in retirement became an important civil rights leader in his own right. Harry Truman became interested as president in the situation of African Americans in the South. He really hadn't known much about it before he became president, but he began to hear some of the stories of lynchings and other atrocities in the South, and wanted to do something about that. And so in late 1947, Truman appointed a commission to study the predicament of African Americans in the South. And in that year, the commission came forth with a report that was published under the name "To Secure These Rights." And a lot of "To Secure These Rights" is really about disenfranchisement. It's about how African Americans had been deprived of the right to vote by the Jim Crow laws. And that was what especially upset Truman. Partly simply because it was unjust, and he was a fair-minded individual, but also for more pragmatic political reasons. Because if you think about it, in the context of the Cold War, we, the United States, were claiming to be the leaders of the free world, right? The free world. But the Soviets were having a field day, because in their propaganda, they could point to the fact that there were many Americans who were not free, namely African Americans, who weren't even allowed to vote, who weren't allowed to go to the same schools or even use the same water fountains or the same toilets as other citizens. And so the existence of Jim Crow really hurt our image worldwide, and it really hurt us in comparison with the communists. And so in February of 1948, Truman decided to help improve the image of the United States by calling for a law to give blacks in the South the vote again, to protect black voting rights in the South. And in his message to Congress, he specifically said that if the United States is going to lead the struggle for freedom throughout the world, we must guarantee freedom for our own citizens. Now, I don't say that Truman did as much as he should have for the African American community. He certainly didn't, but this was definitely a brave move in 1948, especially because his party, the Democratic Party, was very strong in the South, obviously, and Truman really needed those Southern white Democratic votes if he was going to get reelected. But by calling for black voting rights, Truman offended those white Southern Democratic leaders, so that when the Democratic Convention met in July of 1948, a large number of those Southern Democrats stomped out of the convention and set up their own third party called the Dixiecrats and nominated a strong segregationist, Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, as their presidential candidate. So this Dixiecrat candidacy of Thurmond really threatened to deprive Truman of re-election. And you might, at this point, have expected Truman to back down and say, "Oh, I didn't really mean that," and kind of waffle on the issue. But Truman was really made of sterner stuff than that. And not only did he continue calling for a Voting Rights Act, but in July of 1948, Harry S. Truman ordered that all federal facilities be desegregated, including the United States Armed Forces. So it was actually Truman, not FDR, who started the process of desegregating the U.S. military. It would not be completed right away. It was a process that took a number of years, but it was Truman who really got that ball rolling. And the 1948 election is a very interesting election because nobody really expected Harry S. Truman to win. I mean, with Thurmond actually won 4 states in the South, and that took 4 traditionally Democratic states out of Truman's column. Also, the Republican opponent, Governor Thomas Dewey of New York, was very popular, and he was polling well ahead of Truman in all major national polls. And it really, really looked like Truman was going to go down to defeat. And on the election night, actually, it was reported that Truman had lost, and the Chicago Tribune came out with their early morning headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." But when, as you see there in the picture, it was Truman who got the last laugh, because when the votes were all counted, Truman had squeaked through and defeated Dewey. And earned a second term in his own right, one of the biggest political surprises in American history. But Truman's second term was even more turbulent than his first term because of the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Well, a little background to the conflict known as the Korean War. Actually really comes partly out of the revolution in China. Before and during World War II, the Chinese Communist Party, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, had been fighting against the government, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, had been fighting a revolution. And finally, in October of 1949, the Communists won defeated Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, and declared China to be a communist country called the People's Republic of China. And of course, that is still the case today, although it's officially a one-party communist dictatorship. In the last 40 years, China, of course, has now embraced capitalism, big business, and free enterprise. So essentially, you've got a communist dictatorship combined with a capitalist economy. It'll be interesting to see how long that lasts. But in the aftermath of this revolution, the nationalists moved to the small island of Taiwan off the southern coast of China, and they declared themselves to be the official Chinese government. So for many years, actually, Taiwan was our main ally. And I remember when I was little, nowadays, everything says made in China. In those days, it said made in Taiwan because we were only trading with them. It was President Nixon who actually started our modern friendly relationship with the People's Republic. And they are now our #1 trading partners, of course. Well, anyway, Harry S. Truman was widely blamed for what was called the loss of China. In other words, he was blamed for supposedly allowing China to go communist. And so he was determined not to let any other country in Asia, especially, follow in China's footsteps. And that's the background for the conflict that broke out in Korea. So after World War II, Korea had been split into two halves, much like Germany. The northern half, North Korea, was controlled by the Soviets, and the southern half, South Korea, was essentially dominated by the U.S. And of course, North Korea, if you watch the news or read the news, North Korea today is still a communist regime under the leadership of Kim Jong-un. And obviously, they are still a major enemy of the United States in the world, and there has been much discussion in the news recently about this, obviously. So it's still a huge issue. So in June of 1950, the communist government of North Korea launched an invasion of South Korea, and they captured the capital city of South Korea, which is Seoul, and in fact captured nearly the entire country. And Truman simply couldn't allow that to happen politically. And so, in keeping with the doctrine of containment, Truman went to the United Nations with a proposal that the UN launch a quote-unquote police action against North Korea to try to liberate South Korea. So he didn't call it a war, he called it a police action. And supposedly, this was an alliance or a coalition. And there were troops from many different countries who fought in Korea, but essentially, the United States were in the driver's seat. Our military leadership were in charge of this UN police force in Korea that was trying to take South Korea back from the North Koreans. And the UN actually approved this. You may ask, why didn't the Soviets veto it? Well, it just so happened that at this point, the Soviets had kind of taken their ball and gone home. They had quit the UN temporarily. They were mad that Taiwan had gotten the China seat on the Security Council rather than the People's Republic, and so the USSR was boycotting the UN, and that enabled Truman to get UN support for his police action, what we call the Korean War. Now, the leader of the troops, the UN troops in the Korean War, was General Douglas MacArthur, a very flamboyant, almost an egomaniac general, one of our important generals from World War II. MacArthur landed his troops in South Korea and very quickly and dramatically drove the North Koreans all the way up to the 38th parallel, the line that's separating North from South Korea. And he really wanted to go even farther. In fact, he wanted to push the North Koreans all the way back up to the Chinese border. And so Truman allowed MacArthur to do that so that we would be in a better bargaining position. But that turned out to be a big mistake, because when MacArthur pushed the North Koreans back to the Chinese border, you can imagine how China felt. There, there we were with a large, mostly American army sitting right on their boundary. And MacArthur really didn't help matters, because he openly advocated that the United States attack China and, in fact, drop nuclear bombs on China. So obviously that made the Chinese even more alarmed. And so China sent a huge army of about 1 million men into North Korea, counterattacking against our forces and pushing us halfway back down the Korean peninsula to the slightly wavy line you see there on the map. And at that point, the war settled down into basically a stalemate. Truman was ready to get out of the war. He really wanted to negotiate with the Chinese and the Soviets, but MacArthur made a number of public statements objecting to that. And of course, in our system of government, it's the president who is the commander-in-chief. He is the supreme commander of all the armed forces. And so what MacArthur was doing by undercutting Truman's authority amounted to what's called insubordination, and Truman simply couldn't put up with that. So on April 11th, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of command, fired him from his position. But most Americans really sided with MacArthur in this dispute, and MacArthur became a celebrity and gave a lot of speeches. For example, a very famous speech to Congress where he said that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Very famous statement by MacArthur. So most Americans were on MacArthur's side. They blamed Truman for firing this very talented general, and Truman's popularity sank even further as more and more Americans began to die in this war without gaining any territory. This bloody stalemate in Korea. You see an iconic image from the Korean War on the right there, showing that compassion exists even in the most difficult situations. Another factor that reduced Truman's popularity had to do with a senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy gave a speech on February 9th, 1950 in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he waved a piece of paper and announced that it contained a list of 205 card-carrying communists who worked in the United States government under Harry S. Truman. This launched what we call sometimes the Red Scare or McCarthyism, in which Senator Joseph McCarthy was allowed from his position in the Senate to persecute, hound, and harass many Americans who were accused of being communists. And so he would hold hearings to try to out or expose communists in the government, and then later also in the entertainment industry. There were many important Hollywood film directors, actors, and screenwriters who were put on what was called the blacklist and not allowed to work because they were or were suspected to be communists. And so McCarthyism was another factor in Truman's declining popularity. And so even though he could have actually run for re-election in 1952, Truman chose not to do that. But that will be the cliffhanger to leave you in suspense. What happened in the 52 election. Until next time.